If you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen I've been posting these cloth reels recently. I've been dubbing them as dynamic cloth studies. Now really what this was an extension from me doing the Windows 11 type stuff a couple of months ago. It's a very similar workflow, at least the way I was selling the art direction, but the simulation setup is a little bit different, and I want to go over that and go over just how we can tweak the parameters and tweak the geometry to get this very flattering effect, and I'll go over the art direction a little bit towards the end as well in Octane. It's very, very simple stuff, and definitely a successor to that previous tutorial. So we're going to start off with a plane. We're going to drop that holding Alt into a cloner. We'll set that to linear, and the count I was generally sat at between about 15 and 25. The distance on the y-axis can be important. We may have to come back to that later. It's one of those parameters you're going to want to look out for and pay attention to in terms of the way the cloth, the individual pieces of cloth respond to each other. I'm going to turn off the work plane, and I'm going to press NB, and then I'm going to do, just so we can see the segments, I'm going to do Control D, and I'm going to turn off the gravity, so just zero out that gravity parameter. And next up, here's where the look starts to come to be a little bit. So the width, we're going to jack this up to, let's say 2000, sorry, not the width, the height, 2000, and we're going to jack up the height segments to, for now, let's say 100. And where this really begins to take shape is we're going to give it pretty much no width segments. And what that is going to do is when we put in our simulation forces, that's going to make the cloth bunch up on itself, and we're not really going to give it any room to deform on this axis, which is only really going to give us cloth on one axis. The rest of it is going to be quite stiff, which is going to be what creates the look. So I'm going to drop a cloth tag on the cloner, and then I'm going to drop in a rotation to begin with. We're going to rotate that 90 degrees, holding shift. And then we're going to drop in a spherical field. We'll set the angle speed to about 100 for now, and we'll set the mode to force. We'll set this to about 150, which is about 5 seconds. And then when we hit play, nothing's going to happen because we want to bring up the scale of that spherical field, bring that closer to the top again. When we hit play now, we should start to see something happening. Excuse me, not a whole lot going on right now. So what we're going to want to do is bring this down, scale it up a bit more. Have a look at this. You'll see over time this is going to start rolling in on itself. And that was largely how I got the look. So a couple tweaks we can do to lean into this more. I'm going to leave this for now, and I'm going to set the speed a little bit higher, a little bit, all the way up to 1000. That's going to push it in a lot more aggressively, and that's more of the look I was going for. So a lot of this came to life in the retiming. I'll go into Alembic retiming towards the end of setting up the various looks and whatnot. Again, I went over that in the Windows 11 tutorial. So what we can do to art direct this into a slightly nicer place is I'm going to pop a subdivision on it, and I'm going to pop, that was holding Alt to put that straight as a parent of the cloner, and I'm going to put a cloth surface on it, and we're just going to set these to 1, turn off the cloth surface, set the thickness to 0.5, we'll come back to that later. This is really only useful right now for viewing how the cloth's going to look when it's subdivided. So have a look there, we can get a bit of a better look at it. And even in the viewport, turning on the cloth surface is going to help with that too. I'm going to turn off the spherical field in the viewport for now. And first tweak we're going to do, we're going to drop in a step effector. So I brought this down in the y-axis, and I put most of the planes underneath the world axis. And the reason for that is because when we pop in the step effector, what we're going to do is we're basically just going to scale in a tiny bit, just a smidge. The smaller the plane, the smaller the geometry, the more it's going to be likely to be deformed by the force. So what we can do is entice the ones at the top to be deformed a lot more and to get sucked in quicker, and then the ones at the bottom, because they're bigger pieces of mass, aren't going to get sucked in so quick. So now the bottom ones, or the top ones, sorry, are going to get sucked in really quick, and then the top ones are going to be a little bit stiff. You could amplify that by having it, thinner in the middle, thicker at the top, and that'll create a nice look. The next thing I did was I dropped in a random effector. And with this, if you give all of these a value of about 2, and it's just going to offset them ever so slightly, then that's going to give us some slightly different layers once it rolls up in itself. You can see that's a similar look there. So what we can do next is to get, if you want more rolls, you want it to roll up more, you just bump up the height segments. The more height segments we give it, the more it's going to roll up in itself. If you go too many, you're going to end up getting a really, really big whirlpool of them, and that's not going to look too nice. So what I would suggest is let's bring up the height even more to something like 4,000. And what that's going to do is if we were to set some sort of Instagram composition, which would be 1920 by 1080, and we were to drop in a camera and set this to about 135mm, is now when we play this, we're going to have all these big deformations at the center, and then the cloth is going to largely run outside of the composition, which is going to make for a nice look towards the end. So from here, where I'm going to go is I'm going to come out of that camera, just for now, and I just want to get a little bit more detail in here, and I want to get a little bit more of those layers, a little bit more depth, just make it a little bit more interesting. So at this point, you know, I've narrowed in the parameters, I've narrowed in the workflow, it's been in relatively straight line, but now I'm going to start going into experimentation a little bit and messing with things. So I'm sorry if the values that I'm putting in aren't super predictable or super easy to follow. I am going to mess with this and try and art direct it to a place that looks nice. And I would suggest that you do the same thing. Whether you want to copy everything and every single parameter that I'm putting in, you can do, but what I would suggest is maybe a better way of following the tutorial is to observe what I'm doing and then pay attention to that rather than following along, as I might be quite jittery for this next part. And then once you've seen that, doing the same thing and being aware of the parameters that was changing to get the result. So one thing I'm going to do, and I'll try and elaborate as I'm going along, I'm going to bring in this scale a little bit more. I'm going to bring up the height segments a little bit more. Pull that in. One thing I'm going to do as well is I'm actually going to bring this up a little bit. I'm going to drop in a turbulence, which we want from Simulate Forces Turbulence. The turbulence is going to help, I'm going to turn off the rotation, just give us a little bit more life in the cloth before it gets sucked into the rotation. So if we have a look at what that's doing, that's maybe a bit too much. Let's say 60 and 50. Now we have a decent amount of turbulence. Let's mix that with the rotation. And now we're getting a little bit of both, which is giving things a bit more of a less uniform look and exemplifying those layers. We come back in the camera, turn on the cloth surface. We've got more of that kind of final look that I had with that bubblegum type one. So I don't know how much more playing I actually want to do with that. I don't want to waste too much time. One thing I will go over, I mean, this was really how I've been doing a lot of the looks. Different things have been changing to what I've noticed has been what's been dictating the look going in different directions as I've been making these over the last couple of weeks is largely coming from the width and the height of the plane, how far, how deep it is. Sorry, I shouldn't do that there. How deep it is, even on that x-axis there, and the height segments as well. If we were to give it some width segments, let's just have a look at that with the turbulence, and you're going to see that there's going to be a little bit more spread out in the way that it deforms. It is going to go a lot slower, unfortunately, which is a massive downside of it. So let's even that out with something like 15, because we only had a little amount, we only had like 3. And now if we play through that, you're going to see you get a little bit more deformation on the sides, which is how I created that first blue one, was pumping up the width segments more. And that's why these are curling in more in themselves. And that's why these two are more linear, is because they don't really have those width segments. And you can see now, just from playing through that, you've got more of that look like the blue one, where it's folding over itself in various different ways. So for now, I'm going to keep this on about 3. And super speedy simulation. What I'm probably going to do next is cache this and then look at doing a little bit of an alembic retime to seeing what kind of look we can get through art direction in Octane. Super simple setup, very similar to the Windows stuff, just about a carbon copy in terms of workflow. I think this should work really nice for getting some interesting looks. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cache this. To do that, I'm going to turn off the subdivision surface. I'm going to turn off the cloth surface. Before I do that, depending on the complexity of the simulation you're going for, whether you're increasing the count, whether you have the pieces of cloth really close together, however you're working on it, I would definitely encourage you to check, bringing down your sub-steps, bringing up your iterations, in terms of seeing the difference that can make to the simulation. Particularly one of them, I ran into a lot of issues. This one specifically, a lot of ray epsilon issues from really, really tight collisions, not really giving it enough sub-steps, or low enough sub-steps, or giving it enough iterations, or collision passes or whatnot. So that's one thing to be on the lookout for. This was a lot of clones though. This was something closer to about 50, and they were really, really big in scale. But generally these more simple ones tend to behave themselves quite nicely, and you shouldn't have too many issues. But regarding cache, we're just going to go on it. We're going to calculate that. We're not really going to make any changes to the cloth tag. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in the way the simulation is going to come out, at least for the look that we're going for. So we're just going to cache that. And then once that is all done and dusted, we now have the cached simulation, and it looks really nice. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to bake this to Alembic. So there's a couple ways we can do this. Generally, I export it out and I export it back in. I think that's probably going to be the better way to go. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to get it put into a folder structure quickly, as I've just went off the whim on an untitled project, and then I'll show you how I go about doing that. So what we're going to do, we're just going to select the cloner. We're going to export Alembic, and I'll just pop this in this same folder here, and we'll just save that. We'll let that export. It's going to go really quick because we're cached. And we're going to go File, Merge, and then we're just going to load that straight back into the scene, and now you can see we've got another one. We can just line that up to the first one. Now what I would suggest doing here, I've noticed in the art direction phase of this, there was a lot of crashes, and a lot of that was coming from having the base simulation in the scene. At least what I came to find after troubleshooting so many of them, kept crashing my computer left and right. I think there was some other issues. I think there was driver issues and whatnot. But nonetheless, what I would suggest doing is saving here, and then Control-Alt-S and save again, and then just delete these four out of the scene. And now we have a second scene with the Alembic, and that's going to be our lighter scene that we're going to art direct. So the first thing I'm going to do is retime the Alembic. So we've got about 5 seconds here. Let's bring that up to about 7 seconds. And then you can see we play through this. This isn't, I mean, it looks alright, but what we can do is we can hold shift and select both these points on the time remapping of the Alembic, change the point types to soft, and now let's just select that first point and give it a big speed bump at the beginning, and then let's bring down the end point a lot so it doesn't even finish the simulation. And now we can see when we play through that, it's going to spring at the beginning, and then it's going to get really, really slow. Probably want it even slower, to be honest. You could even add a second point here, a third point even, which is going to allow us to tighten that up at the beginning even more. That's too quick. And we want it slow and gradual. We want a little bit more lift there. You can see now that's really, really, really nice. Really smooth animation. See if we can play that back with the subdivision. Very nice. Very snappy. So now we've done the retiming. And we're probably good to get going on some art direction. So, with that being said, let's make a nice looking render. So I just wanted to take a little bit of a break from the tutorial and promote my coaching and see if I could be a good fit to help you with your renders. Over the last year and a half, I've been coaching numerous people, and I've built out this entire coaching platform. There's a bunch of modules, working through them, making you recreate my renders, not letting you progress until you perfect those renders. This is really for people that are struggling to build a consistent workflow, struggling to understand what they're doing wrong, struggling to get the same results each time and be able to predict the quality that the output of their renders are going to have. But one thing I noticed over coaching so many people and doing a lot of discovery calls and seeing if I would be a good fit for certain people is that a lot of people were a little bit too experienced for this main coaching that I built. So if you fall into that bracket, you can see here, there's a button, And I did create an offer. I now offer new coaching, which is more for advanced people, where we work on your renders specifically. We get on calls for about an hour every week or multiple times a week if that's what you want. And we go over your work, see if I can help bring things to life, help you with certain workflows, help you with certain things, and seeing how I can help improve your work. So if you fall into either of these brackets, then book a call and we'll see if we'd be a good fit. And the other thing, of course, is my Patreon. I've been making tutorials on Patreon for about a year now, and I've been making a lot more advanced tutorials, various different tutorials. So if you want to go check my tutorials out over there, then definitely go check them out. Lots of cool stuff, lots of lighting stuff, material stuff, nature stuff, tons of different things over here. If you've watched enough of my tutorials or you're subscribed to my Patreon, you always know I do this lovely trick where I press F2, which is accessing these 4 views. This is F1, F2, F3, F4. So I press F2, I come to the top view. I go to cameras, perspective, and we're going to have to reset this to make it look like our first viewport. So again, I'm going to do NA, then I'm going to turn off the work plane, and now we're back to a similar look. And now you can see we're still in this camera, but I can move around here, and Octane is going to reference this viewport here. And that's going to give me a little bit of freedom with the lighting. So with that being said, we'll get Octane on the go, and we're going to be able to work nice and free now. So I'm going to pop Octane on this side, set it to path tracing. We're going to hit render. We're going to lock this. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a texture environment, turn it off in the viewport because it's all ugly and white. We'll set this to near enough black, and then we'll drop in another one, turn it off in the viewport, and I'm going to change this to a gradient. We'll change it to visible environment so we still have our shadows. We'll come into the gradient, we'll set it to 2D V, and I don't know what color I'm going to go for here. I'm trying to think what color I haven't done yet. I think I'll probably just go for pink because you probably clicked because you saw a pink render, and that one seemed to get the best feedback. So I'll just recreate the pink one. So I'll set this to a slightly darker pink at the bottom of the scene. And we want them both quite beige, to be honest with you. We don't want either of these gradient points to be, hyper saturated. So we'll call this gradient. We'll call this shadow. And now we can drop in a light. But before we do that, I'm going to drop in a null, and I'm going to push this to the front of the simulation. I'm going to call this target. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to target the light to this null, and if we target it to the simulation, it's going to target it to all the way down in this axis, and moving axes on Alembics is very irritating. And this is going to be where we're going to be looking, so we're going to want the light to look at that. So we're going to target that animation text, target on the light, target that. And now I'm just going to move this light down off to the side. We're going to turn it off the camera visibility. And I'm going to make it quite tall, just so it covers everything. I don't really like the shadow that it's causing there, so I'm going to try the other side. Something like that should work for now. We're going to drop in a Octane camera tag, enable the camera imager, enable ACES tone mapping. We're going to bring up that exposure a little bit, bring up a bit of vignetting, bring down the hot pixel removal. And with the camera, let's get something nice. Let's set this to 200. We'll come onto the bottom here. I'm going to save that for good luck. And I'm going to lighten up the shadows, just a smidge. And we're going to drop in a Octane specular material. We're going to pop that on the cloth surface. Couple of things with this material. First thing, we're going to put in a random walk medium, just so it's really, really nice and slick to get the scattering on this. I'm going to drop in a RGB spectrum, plug in the albedo, plug in the transmission, make that pink, and then we're going to give that a whole bunch of roughness. We're going to bring down the reflection quite a lot. We're going to lighten up the color. We're going to bring down the density. One thing to be on the lookout for is fake shadows. That's going to increase the translucency of it significantly. Sometimes, not so much. Kind of depends on the scene. Sometimes I've noticed it boosts it a lot. Sometimes I've noticed it makes it look a lot worse. But it is a button that's there to help you if you need it. Index, you could arguably set that to 1.52. I don't care. I'm going to leave it. So in the light, let's set the sampling rate to 248 and let's bring it closer, make it bigger, push it off to the side. We're going to bring it out a little bit more, make it wider. You could add a fall off map, but I kind of can't be bothered. It's not going to make a huge difference. Let's lighten up the shadows again. In the camera imager, if we bring up the saturation, we can get away with that because we're on ACES tone mapping. It's going to make things look nice. But now what we're seeing is probably a bit too much blowout on these thin parts here. The light's getting through a little bit too much. So I'm going to bring up that density quite a lot. Back up close to 100. And I'm just going to have a little look at that fake shadows. It is helping a lot in this scene. I will give it that. So I'll leave it on for now. I'm going to mess with a couple of different light positions. I'm going to duplicate the light. Let's move it more off to this angle. Now that I like a little bit more. Let's bring up those shadows. And the camera. We'll try a couple of different points in the animation as well. I think that's often good for Lookdev, is move about a little bit, look at it at different points, see how it's going to look. How does the camera look against the light? Doesn't look too bad. The issue is with this one is we have this giant hole in the middle. That's creating a giant black shadow, which is encouraging me to put the light more at the front. But the more we do that, the flatter the render is going to look. I think for now we'll keep it off to the side. One question you may be thinking to yourself is, why am I not adding a second light? The reason for that is because it's probably going to cause a lot of noise in the scene, and I really can't be bothered with that. One thing I've noticed with these scenes is just leave it to one light. You're really not worth tiring yourself out. I think the light looks better on that side, but now we just have to deal with those highlights, so we could be better just bringing up the density of that, and that seems to be the solution. And the camera imager, let's come back here, let's overexpose that, let's bring up the saturation, and in the background, see, I still don't like that. I'm getting rid of that before I end the tutorial. Let's desaturate these a little bit. Mess with the shadows, see if they look good when they're darker. Oh, I'm still in direct lighting. I swear I changed that to path tracing. There you go. That looks a lot better. Did that whole thing on direct lighting. Now let's turn off fake shadows. You can see it's not even making a difference. Okay. I was wondering why that was being so annoying. Okay. Looks a lot better. See that first light now. Here's me thinking my lighting was bad. I was sitting in the back of my head then. I was like, why is it looking so bad as soon as I start recording the tutorial? Octane didn't change to path tracing. Okay. So this is looking certainly a lot nicer now. I think we could probably bring in some of that saturation in the background. You know, the first thing that went through my mind then when I caught that was like, oh crikey, you should just cut this out and re-record the whole thing with it on path tracing. And I've done that a lot in the past when I'm making tutorials. But as I've been making a lot of tutorials on Patreon this year, I've been really realizing that there's so much value in seeing the simple mistakes that hold your renders back in 3D. And I think it's really important to show that and to enable and to understand and, to help people understand that, sometimes these things happen. Sometimes you work in the wrong take for 20 minutes and then you have to copy and paste your whole scene out of it. And it's part of being a 3D artist. So I'm going to accept the humility, and I'm going to leave that in and not be a perfectionist about it. Yeah, I think this looks good. I mean, I'm 27 minutes in, and it's looking not too bad. Turn the camera a bit more, maybe. Let's come all the way up to like one of the end frames. I'm gonna come to the color as well, because you really don't need much color when you're plugging into a transmission. I think if you go lighter and then oversaturate in the camera imager, you're going to get a better result. I think something like that looks nice. Again, let's come back to that fake shadows. Does seem to make it look a little bit nicer, compensate with a higher density. And maybe we'll come back to the shadows once more. Again, just why I'm editing here, I just do want to disclose, I try to do this more in the YouTube tutorials. I do apologize for going back and forth so quickly. It's the creative process, and I do try to say when that's going to occur rather than this is, step by step, because I know it's difficult to leap back and forth with me. I can play with these parameters all day. My aim right now would be to get rid of these highlights and to work with that until the image is feeling really, really even. I think fake shadows is probably not helping with it. I think something like this looks a little bit nicer. I like the contrast of the darker shadows as well. Again, the light's probably not helping. We could always see how a fall-off map on the light looks. We'll duplicate it just so I'm not working destructively. We'll add a fall-off map. Set the power to like 1000. Get that closer. Maybe set it to 180 degrees. That might just soften things a little bit. You'd always go for a longer light rather than a taller light. That could also help. I think the first one's still better though. I always push the light away, bring up the power a little bit. Yeah, this looks good. For a 30-minute tutorial, I'm happy with it, I'll take it. Let's bring down the thickness of that a little bit. But that's going to make all the highlights blur out again. We'll leave it for now. You could put another subdivision in there on top of the cloth surface, but things tend to get a little bit slow and a little bit irritating. I'm going to try it. I've just saved the scene. I'm going to try it once. Oh crikey, it's went up to 2. I should have turned that off. Just going to try and get that off before I turn it back on. The amount of times I've crashed my computer the last 2 weeks doing this has not been fun. See, that's just going to bevel the edges of the cloth surface a little bit more when it eventually catches up, but I don't know how much I recommend doing this. I think I found that just the one subdivision with the cloth surface tends to create a little bit of a nicer look. So that's about it. That's how I've been making these cloth simulations. Really all came down to the segments. Again, that was the art direction. Sorry for it being a little bit all over the place. I hope that you're happy with these results. It does look rather nice. Regarding render settings, I would suggest rendering with the denoiser. And regarding the render settings themselves, you can get away with that on about 248. If you're going to bring down the depth of these, GI clamp can stay on 10. I did just edit those a second ago and then mess up, which is why that was already on 10. may have to bring back down the density again, and maybe at that point fake shadows will be a little bit more helpful. I think that probably looks nicer, to be honest with you. Yeah, very nice render. As always, thank you for watching the tutorial. Thank you for coming along this ride with me and making a bunch of cool renders. I'll probably put this project file up on my Patreon if you want to go over there and subscribe, check everything out, and support me over there. And like I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, be sure to check out my coaching if you want to do coaching with me, whether you're a complete beginner or you're very advanced and you just want somebody to help you with your scenes and get different input and work together to see how we can improve your work. And maybe there's certain things you're stuck on and you think that my realm of expertise would help, whatever it may be. I do offer that, so definitely go check that out. As always, thanks for watching the tutorial, and I wish you all the luck in creating your renders, and I will see you in the next one.